Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Introducing the victims and perpetrators responsible for California's most notorious shootouts, lynchings, and assassinations, this account shows how homemade justice is never black and white. In relating these histories, this discussion also analyzes how and why Hollywood storylines almost always follow the same skewed and unrealistic arc in which the bad guys abuse the good guys. The good guy takes the high road until the bad guy has gone too far, and the good guy picks off the bad guys one by one in an increasingly dramatic fashion. The book that we are featuring this evening is California Justice, Shootouts, Lynchings, and Assassinations in the Golden State, with my special guest, journalist and author, David Kulczyk. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, David Kulczyk.
Thanks for having me on. It's great. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much. We're going to dig right into this. I very much enjoyed your introduction, but before we get to what you wrote in the introduction, which I think is very, very important, and we need to explain the state of the nation at that time, and especially what were the circumstances and surrounding California at that time. How did they treat the Native Americans, what you call the Californios? So let's first question, what brought you to this story? Give us your background or the reason why you decided to write this book about California justice, lynchings, shootouts, and assassinations in the Golden State.
Well, I have a complete fascination and love for California. My wife is from California, and that's how I ended up here. Met in Seattle, and I had never had any idea that I would ever live in California. It never occurred to me. So once I was here, I was just enthralled by the history that surrounds our state. And I worked as a process server while I was writing this book, and I traveled all over Northern California, and I got to, through other books that I had, I got to see places where these things happen firsthand. And I thought, there's a big history of taking justice in your own hands in California. And this book goes all the way from 1850 until 1998 or so. California just has this big history of vigilante justice, and I don't think that people knew about it.
Okay, that's a good segue, because as you write in your introduction, you explain further that you said in between, and this was fascinating to me and pretty horrifying, 1849 to 1953, you say there were over 200 lynchings. And so, as you write in the beginning of California Justice, there have been thousands of books and movies made about persons taking the law into their own hands, as you mentioned, and you talk about that basic storyline, but to refute that storyline that we see in the movies and we've read in the books, tell us really what California was like at that time in the 1800s. And I had alluded to it about how the Caucasians that were there were treating the Native Americans and the Mexicans. So tell us a little bit about the history in California in 1800s to set the stage so that we can more fully understand some of this book, California Justice.
Well, California had explosive population growth once the gold rush started in 1848, 1849. And Sacramento, for instance, went from 11 Caucasians to 20,000 in a matter of a few years. And when that happened, these miners showed up, and most of them were just people out to try something new, just to get a shot at it. A lot of people don't realize is that when people came to California for the gold rush, a lot of people ended up going back home after 7 or 8 years, or 10 years or so. A lot of them just didn't stay. They came here. A lot of them came here and died. And back in those days, people didn't carry IDs around, and Uncle Joe went out west, and they never saw him again. There was no police at all out here, and even today, California is a massive state. We have over 30 mountain ranges in this state. Deserts, everything from. I like to tell people that we have more rednecks than most people have people in their states, because this state is just so massive. And at the same time, even today, you can drive down state highways and not see a car for a half hour. So even today, it's still a fairly extensive place. When people came to California, the gold rush, the average age was 26 years old. So basically, it was like a giant frat party here. People, the water was bad, so people drank alcohol all the time. An egg costs $1, which would be crazy now. Even a shovel costs $50, which you can go to Home Depot and pick one up for $15 or something. Nowadays. Yeah. So, without having grandma and neighbors and people knowing what they were doing, a lot of these people misbehaved terribly, and they would take pot shots at Indians just for no reason. They would just actually when the gold miners first came out here, the Native Americans that lived in California were here for 15,000 years, and they had a complete civilization set up along the rivers. And California split with the Stanislaus or the San Joaquin River coming from the south to like the San Francisco Bay, and the Sacramento River that flows north, and all these rivers flow from the mountains into it. The natives had villages about every 2 miles, maybe 30 to 300 people. They all traded among each other, and their family bond was everything. If they had a fight with another village, they did not hurt each other. They played coup on each other, and if somebody was injured or hurt, the other person's village would make amends for it, even if it meant that the murderer had to work as a slave for that village for so many years or things. So everything was already civilized here. When the Spaniards came, and of course they were backed by the Catholic Church and everything, and they always had priests with them, and they didn't realize that they were in the Garden of Eden. They were the natives are naked and they just eat food that's on the ground. It's sounds like the Garden of Eden to me.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine, is basically what happened to California to the Native Americans that lived there. They first were wiped out by smallpox in around 1845 or so when Fremont came out here. Within a year, 90% of the natives died. It was just massive, massive death. Measles, smallpox, things like that just wiped them completely out. So by the time the gold rush happened, you basically had a civilization like in the Mad Max movies, just stragglers from villages, people without their families anymore. And so when the gold rush people came, they saw the most pathetic people you can even imagine. They were all just, their families, their children, their wives, their husbands were all dead. And so they gravitated towards where the white civilization was, and that didn't work out very good most of the time.
Now let's get to some of the examples that you have in the introduction as well. They're just for example, you note in 1863, one of the first stories that you note right in the introduction to demonstrate the point that you just made, and where some ranchers discover their horses are gone. So tell us the process of taking justice into your own hands, law into your own hands, in that story that you write in the introduction, 1863.
Yeah, that was up around Chico, which is about an hour north of Sacramento, and that's where I live. Chico's a college town. And so outside of Chico in 1863, this guy's horses disappeared. So they figured some Native Americans took them. The first Native Americans they came across, they lynched. And the next day, the horses came back to the barn. It turned out that they just went for a hike, and they weren't stolen at all. In Yuba City, until the late 70s, there was a bar there that had a photograph on their wall of a tree, a big live oak tree, with like 20 bodies of Native Americans hanging by ropes for their necks on it, like a Christmas tree. So it was bad. Most of the men were dead. The women were made into prostitutes for the most part, and the children were made into slaves, farm labor. The funny thing is, I thought this was funny, is that when all the miners came out here, they didn't bring women with them. There were very few women here, and the Native Americans thought that the white men were all gay, which I think is hilarious, because they're like, "Hey, where's your women? Who travels without their family?" So
interesting.
Up in
now you write. Go ahead.
Up
sorry.
in Siskiyou County, I believe in the 1870s, they made a treaty with the Native Americans. They invited them from all over the place to come and have a feast, and they had a big barbecue, and they made Indian bread for them, and they poisoned the Indian bread, and they figure up to 10,000 people may have died from poisoning or from getting gunned down afterwards.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Now, in this first chapter, you still have what we're talking about is the San Francisco Vigilante Committee of 1851, and then again it was another version in 1856. And you call it a phantom government set up in place of the ultra-corrupt official one that was that allowed criminals at that time and politicians to commit all kinds of crimes, including murder, robbery, and assault, basically with impunity. So these were known criminals. So tell us a little bit about the formation of the San Francisco Vigilante Committee. This is a fascinating story to start our interview.
Yeah, no one had IDs, and no one could check what somebody was before they came to California. So all kinds of criminals and lowlifes came here too, and a lot of them were professional politicians back east. Hate to say Philadelphia, but it was the whole Philadelphia lawyer thing is where that comes from. A lot of Sharpies came here, and San Francisco just exploded. It went from a village in the sand dunes to a massive city in just a matter of a few years. And they pretty much did anything they wanted to, and they would be, if they got arrested, they'd be just turned around and released back into general population. There was no consequences for them. They were untouchable. So they had, in the 1851 case, a bunch of Australians managed to get to San Francisco, and they were called the Sydney Hounds. And they would just go into tent neighborhoods and, loot, rob, rape, kill, whatever they wanted. And it got to the point where, real upright citizens were starting to get robbed by these guys. And so that's how the first one was formed, just to chase these Aussies and any bad people out. They just hung people up from poles and things just as a warning. And the ships were all full leaving town. A lot of them ran out into the mountains, too, to the gold rush area. In 1856, it was caused by there was even more. The corruption came back, and King James of Williams, this guy had this really crazy name. He made it up because there were so many James Williamses everywhere, and he was the founder and editor of the San Francisco Bulletin. And he got shot by this city supervisor, which is just incredible if you think about it. This guy named James P. Casey, and he was a fixer of elections, and he won his seat in the Board of Supervisors with more votes than were registered voters.
Right.
So King James of Williams, was assassinated by this gambler, Charles Cora. And that guy shot this U.S. Marshal. So that's what started it. Is that first this U.S. Marshal gets shot by a guy and he gets released, and then the editor of the paper gets assassinated. And people just thought, well, this is too much. This is a U.S. Marshal and the editor of their major newspaper gets assassinated, and these guys are walking out on the street.
Now, we're talking about a membership, too, which was amazing to me, was over 3,000 volunteers in military formation, you write, marched to the jail and demanded the two prisoners to be given up to this second committee of vigilance. And with the membership of 8,000 at that time. And so the sheriff gave them up. It was a hasty trial. So tell us what happened at this trial.
At this trial, They actually had a defense for it. They set it up just like any other court in America, because the court was so corrupt in San Francisco that they formed it just like it should be, and there was a lot of anger going on. There was the National Guard was sitting in a ship in the bay, waiting to get orders to invade San Francisco, and they ended up. They made this gallows out of a building. It was a warehouse in San Francisco. They called it Fort Gunny Sacks because most of these men that were in San Francisco too, a lot of them were in the Mexican-American War, and when the war was over, they just hey, California, there's gold in that. So we had a whole bunch of ex-soldiers, and they weren't about ready to get pushed around, and they were all trained and everything. So they took this place and they made like a maze of sandbags to go around it, so that they couldn't get rushed. They had to kind of go through a zigzag through all the sandbags and stuff, and it was totally secure. When they were done with the trial, they just basically pushed the guy out the window with a rope around his neck and died right out in front.
And nobody was prosecuted for that. It was the end. They disbanded. You say they disbanded this and gave back the officials the responsibility for law and order, didn't they?
Yeah. I write more about that in actually my latest book, Fruit Flakes and Nuts. I write about a couple of people that were part of that their lives were even more bizarre afterwards. So, because a lot of those people, like one of the guys ended up being the governor of Kansas or something, the founder of Denver, and a lot of these people went on to be in government.
Yeah, it's incredible. There's an incredible story. As we turn the pages, the story seems to, as we'll talk about in another couple stories in this interview, where has some modern parallels with the last escape with the two prisoners in New York State and with their accomplice. So very, very interesting that 150 years there are some parallels with modern day escapes and true crime. In the same vein of the citizens taking over or a committee forming to take law and order into their own hands, the next story I thought were very fascinating was for what it really explores is the citizens of Little Lake Strike Back, and Elijah Frost. The Porters and the Coates. So it's Hatfield and McCoys here of sorts, with Elijah Frost and his family and the Coates, which are Union supporters. So tell us a little bit about this, and before we talk about 1867 October and Election Day in Mendocino County.
Yeah, the Coates family. Hang on, let me. Okay, the Coates family were. Well, the Frost family were Confederate supporters, and they came up from Missouri and settled in Mendocino County. At the same time, there was the Frost family. They were equally homicidal and a huge family, and they used to just get into big fights, usually, especially during the Civil War. And they were always well armed and fighting and stuff. You kind of don't think about things like that about California. You know, you think of like in the movies, the Wild West is always with the wagon trains and things like that, but much more things happen in California than pretty much everywhere else when it comes down to it. On October 16th, 1867, it was Election Day, and the families were coming in. People were coming in to vote, and it was a holiday back then. It should be now too. That'd be really great. They ended up getting into a fight. The Frosts picked a fight with the Coates, and it killed 5 members of the Coates family. And one member of the Frost family was shot in the chest with a double-barrel shotgun. 3 other people of that family were seriously wounded. So, that put a big chill on the family feud, and things kind of cooled out from there. But Elijah Frost, his father, was one of the ones that were killed. He's named after his father. And he had 2 other brothers. They did nothing but get into trouble. They were put into custody of his older sister or something. And they basically, he just stole horses and just did any kind of petty crimes he could. He was put in prison for stealing horses. And when he got out of prison, he had some friends that he met there. And they came with him over to Little Lake. And this guy was Abijah Gibson and Thomas McCracken. And so they would just, petty thievery, break-ins. They were drunk all the time. They'd pick fights with people, shoot guns in the air. And people were getting tired of it, It wasn't, people were well aware of the whole Wild West thing. And what they wanted to do was make it a civilized place. People could have their families there and get on with commerce. So in 1879, those guys killed an entire flock of geese. They tied their heads on a rail of fence. And whenever people would press charges against these guys, they would always threaten them, and so then people wouldn't testify, and so they'd get released. And this time those guys were caught, and they would always jail these guys in hotels because they didn't have a lot of jails around. So while they were waiting for their hearing, they were threatening revenge, anyone who would testify against them. And so on September 4th, they crowd of people came over to the jail and took them out. 2 of them were handcuffed together. They tied them around the neck with a noose and threw them off a bridge. Left them there until the next day to make sure that everyone saw it.
That was the goal, was to leave those bodies there so that the next town could tell that the justice had been done, and not to mess with this little town, if you were thinking about it or contemplating it, wasn't it?
Yeah. And also they wanted the people to know that things were going to get a little better here, because they weren't going to be putting up for this kind of stuff. They happened a lot in California where, it was downright terrorism, where people would just, sweating right there in the courtroom, And people had their own guns in the courtroom. They would pull out guns on each other and stuff. It's pretty amazing if you think about something like that happen now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another aspect of the state of the nation, and also especially California, is the railroad and the advent of the railroad and what the railroad meant for society and for commerce and the economy. So tell us about the sentiment towards the railroad and why, before we talk about John Sontag and his accomplices in 1867.
Yeah, Sontag was really something. He was a folk hero. The Southern Pacific Railroad ran California. At one point, a senator and the governor were part of the members of the Big Four of the businessmen that started it. Crazy if you think about it. That would be, it would be like if Bill Gates became governor of Washington State, or Mark Zuckerberg became governor or senator from California. It's just unbelievable. But then, back then, the railroad did anything they wanted. So they would renege on agreements because the railroad got land on every side of the track for 5 square miles, and so they would sell the land and say, if you improve it for 5 years, you could buy it at the market price of when you first came to your property. And of course, the railroad reneged on that. People would have beautiful farms and crops and everything, orchard, and the railroad would come and say, no, that's our land. We're going to take it from you. They also made it so that the rates, freight rates, it was more expensive to ship something inside California on the railroads than it would be to send it all the way across country to Chicago. It was cheaper to send a product from Sacramento to Chicago than from Sacramento to Bakersfield, which is
and the farmers knew this, right?
Right. Because the CEOs of the Southern Pacific Railroad were the governor and senators and all those things. They were heavily inside the government of California.
Now, to demonstrate this story is John Sontag is working for Southern Pacific Railroad, and while he's working, his ankle is crushed. And now he's hospitalized, but he's discharged before he's fully healed. And when he goes back to work, when he's forced back to work, he requests light duty, and subsequently he's fired. So now he has this lifelong grudge against the railroad,
right?
Against Southern Pacific Railroad, and you just described the sentiment in general for a lot of the farmers and the citizens that the railroad was exploitive to a lot of people. Now, you talk about while he was recovering, Sontag met Chris Evans. And so tell us about the meeting of Chris Evans and what kind of guy Chris Evans is and why he would share any kind of sentiment that Sontag had.
Well, it's kind of funny. Chris Evans was born in Canada, and he was a lot older. He was nearly 50 years old when he came out to California. And they settled in San Joaquin. He ended up having families and stuff, and he had 7 kids. But his homestead was taken away because they found out that the title was invalid from he bought the property from a guy who really didn't own it. And that happened a lot, too. That happened with Grizzly Adams, who lost 4 or 5 different homesteads because he was just like, yep, I'll buy it. And then it turns out that the guy didn't even own it. That sold it to him. So Evans, he worked at a bank. He had a livery station in Modesto, worked land and stuff. But, they were all getting screwed by the railroads all the time. Around that time, there was the Muscle Shoals massacre, where some railroad guys that were Pinkerton detectives were meeting up with these farmers who were representing the other farmers in the area, and they were basically bushwhacked. 5 of them were murdered. And of course, one railroad guy was murdered, and so they had it totally, flipped out on it. There's even books now that don't even get it right about that whole massacre. So they started robbing trains. They were tired of the railroads screwing around. They were pretty good at robbing trains. They believed that they robbed a few, like in Wisconsin and Minnesota, kind of like practices before they came back to California to start robbing the banks.
Now, you say these are really well-planned robberies, and they're using explosives as well. So tell us what would they need the explosives for? Tell us the circumstances that they would use those explosives in their robbery on that train.
Well, the money was in the rail car. Or it was in the mail car, and the mail car had a safe, and there was always a guard in there. You could not get entry into the mail car from the other parts of the train. They had a door, it was locked on the inside, and they would stop the train, and if the person wouldn't open the door, they would put dynamite on it and blow the door up, basically blow up the whole car. They used that in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That was a thing that happened with Evans and Sontag, where they put too much dynamite on the car and just blew it to bits. And the money was flying everywhere. But
and we're talking about... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
We're talking about the money we're talking is like $20,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did pretty good. They would get out like, $5,000. And imagine how much money $5,000 was in the 1880s. I mean, that's amazing amount of money. So they would get that money, and then they would lay low and go back to their farms and their families, and a year later they'd go hit another one. They hit one in 1890. It was actually pretty close to where my publisher's building is. It's kind of funny. But a hobo thought the train stopped and jumped off, and they accidentally shot him. And they got $20,000 out of that one. So now blood was spilled, and the Southern Pacific was getting a lot more concerned.
Yes, and so again, it's interesting that they would lay that low, that they would go back to their farms and assume this other life and then wait that long, even though they'd made that much money. So very uncharacteristic of today's thieves, it sounds like. They're getting a close call. So tell us about the close call, and so what is their response to the close call? Their response to that close call? Eventually you're talking about 1891.
Yeah.
So tell us what happens as they proceed with these. I mean, on their third one, is there a close call that necessitates them changing how they do things? Tell us how they.
They tried to blow up the express car, the mail car, and the bombs were all duds. And the crewmen jumped out and started firing at them, and they had to run without getting anything. So they laid low again. They were, that's when they disappeared for a while and went out to the Midwest and shot and robbed some things. There's also a rumor that Jesse James was involved with them, that he was out in California around that time. That can't really be verified for obvious reasons, but there's some truth to it that it could be possible. So they got out of there after the big shootout with the railroad people, because they had the Pinkertons after them and everything. So they left town for about a good year or so.
But they return basically because a couple of them, 2 of them anyway, want to come back. Evans and Sontag. One maybe George doesn't want to come back. Sontag's brother, but 2 of them want to come back, and so they do come back to California, and then they proceed to rob again, don't they?
Yeah. And this time they grabbed a bunch of coins that turned out to be from Peru and were worthless. And they didn't realize that until they got back to their hideout where one of their farms was, I think the Sontag's farm. So, and that was kind of like the smoking gun that brought the railroad people on them. They went to, they were questioning people everywhere, and nobody wanted to, they were folk heroes, robbing the railroad. It was like when, Dillinger was robbing banks, for 19 months. That's as long as Dillinger robbed banks. He robbed 19 of them. And, people were happy, My father told me everybody would cheer when they'd say on the radio that Dillinger robbed another bank, and they were like, good for him,
Yeah.
So it was the same thing with Southern Pacific. People didn't want to talk, and, it was, they were finding they were getting stonewalled. So the sheriff went to Evans Ranch to question him, and he was talking to his daughter, Eva, who was a real pistol. She went on after the trial and things and wrote plays that they performed in San Francisco, and she would portray herself and stuff. And it's actually pretty humorous to raise money for their legal fees. So the sheriff was talking to Eva, and she was saying he was not there. And actually, one of the Sontags was right behind the door and blasted them with a shotgun. They ran away. The wounded officers ran away, and that night they came up with a posse, and they were waiting. They didn't know that Sontag and Evans already left, and they approached them, and actually they were there, but they were in an outbuilding, so they came up to the house. Just like they do now, where they surround it and everything. But what they didn't know is that they were really in an outbuilding. So they had their backs to them, and they had a big exchange of gunfire, killed a deputy sheriff, and George Sontag got captured there, and he sang like a canary about all the stuff they did. But they still had no idea where they were. What they would do is they were close to Sequoia National Park, and they would go hunting there, and so they knew the area really well. There's tons of caves and things up there, and the people in the area would bring supplies up to them and just leave them. They would just leave them, knowing that they would find it. It was just kind of like leaving an offering for the Evans and Sontag. So the cops all came over to Evans' farm, and they found the coins, so they knew the Peruvian coins, and they found bags of cash and stuff. So they knew that they were totally involved in the whole situation. They were hiding out in Sequoia National Park, and if you ever go to Sequoia National Park now, there's only one road in and one road out. It's still a real hassle to get to. So you can imagine these guys doing it with horses and stuff. But they had a shootout again killed 2 more cops and wounded another. So 10 months later, they were still hiding in Sequoia and living off the land and food that they had. They were watching their house all the time. They supposedly held up a stagecoach that they thought that one of the Pinkerton guys was on, and they didn't steal anything or anything. They just had everybody get out, and they saw that the guy from the railroad wasn't on, and they just told them to go. So they were like looking out for him, just ready to assassinate. So yeah, they ambushed another posse. They were just unstoppable. Until they were eventually caught really badly.
What's interesting about this as well is that they're sentenced to life in prison, and then Evan's daughter comes into the story again and convinces this jailer named Ed Morrell to smuggle a gun and to help her father escape.
Yeah.
So as Morrell, though, very much like I said I alluded to in the when we first spoke, was that it's very much like this recent New York State breakout with the two prisoners with the accomplice, is that this Morrell he gets rattled and he shoots the police chief. He shoots the chief of police, J.D. Morgan.
Yeah.
And then he spooks all the horses, and so Evans isn't able to escape. And then you figure, okay, well now he's caught. But then again, as you write in your book, these two guys horsejack another team, and then they disappear. So finally, rob somebody else, and finally they get imprisoned. And then you go, well, that'll be the end of them. Well, no, they're actually both paroled. So tell us a little bit about what I just sort of skipped over there. Tell us a little bit about the details of what happens in this story that seems to never end.
Well, they were finally ambushed at their cabin, and it was just a cabin that was built by somebody, and they waited for them to come back, and they had a big shootout. There's a famous picture of Sontag laying against a manure pile, just shot up, and all the Pinkerton guys are standing around like he's a trophy that they shot, a $20 deer or something. Evans crawled all the way, like for miles. He crawled to another farm, and he lost an arm and an eye. Sontag ended up dying there in a jail after infection set in. He was shot on a manure pile, so I don't think it was going to be clean. But Ed Morrell is just, it's just amazing that Eva must have had a real charming way about her to persuade this Ed Morrell guy, who was just a waiter, that the jail had his restaurant cater to the jail for food for the prisoners. And that she was able to talk him into smuggling a gun to her father and helping him jailbreak and then helping him rob is just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also talk about Detective Smith, too, being very, very creative and being on the arch nemesis of Evans and Sontag in terms of he creating a rumor and spreading that rumor that Evans' daughter was dying of diphtheria, his youngest daughter, and so he waited for them, and of course Evans fell for it, and Sontag fell for it, and they were both captured. So very, very interesting. I wanted to just mention that we have to stop for a word from our sponsor, so we'll be right back, and we've got more to talk about. So we'll be right back, and we'll talk about this message from DirecTV. Right now they have a super offer, $19.99 a month for 12 months with a 24-month agreement. DirecTV is a truly superior alternative to cable with access to over 285 channels and DirecTV's most advanced HD DVR system ever. And right now, 3 months free of HBO, Showtime, Stars, and Cinemax with the Select through Ultimate packages. Watch anytime your favorite true crime like Investigation Discovery, The First 48 Hours, On the Case with Paul Vazan, Crime and Investigation, and my all-time favorite, American Justice. That's in addition to all of the latest television programs, the biggest movies, and the very best in sports programming, offering amazing bundles and amazing savings. So call 1-855-980-3812 and switch to DirecTV today. $19.99 a month for 12 months with 3 free months of your favorite channels. That's DirecTV, 1-855-980-3812. When we last left off, David, we were talking about, of course, the fascinating tale against Rage Against the Railroad. So let's now talk about the last. It's a very short story, but I think it's important just to note the time and note this fascinating story considering the incredible time that it occurs. And so the last lynching in California, tell us when it was and tell us a little bit about the poor man that was his name is lost into history, but 1947 in California. Tell us a little bit about this last lynching in California.
Yeah, this story to me, is one of the most important things that I've ever written in all my books. And I would really like to get a cold case involved in this, because some people are still alive that were involved. On January 6, 1947, these kids were coming back to their one-room school from winter vacation or Christmas vacation. This is in Siskiyou County. There's a lot of lynchings and things up in that area. These kids come to school, and strung up on the telephone pole in front of the school was the body of an African-American man with a calfskin wrapped around his shoulders, and he was full of bullet holes. And there were 8 grades that attended this. I had an eyewitness told me this story. He was just a kid when it happened. And, the kids were all shocked, and the teacher just pulled down the shades, and cops came. My witness that saw this, he went to use the outhouse outside and bumped into a tall man wearing a cowboy hat. And he asked what happened. He said, "This is what happens when you wrestle cattle." So supposedly, this guy was caught wrestling cattle. He had a calf, and he was tentatively identified as a butcher who lived in the town of Weed, which is just kind of up the highway now from I-5 now. But he was caught wrestling this and butchering this calf, and they I don't know if they shot him there and strung him up, or they strung him up and shot him, but it was reported in 2 different papers, the Etna Gazette and the Western Sentinel. They were weekly papers in that area in Siskiyou County. They wrote about what happened, but all the copies disappeared from the library and from the papers itself. So it's never been. Actually, no one really knew about it until I wrote about this, and I found it that it was kind of like it could have happened, and then I did some research and I found a guy that actually was there, and he's a retired Marine major, I do believe. But so this was a straight out cover up too. The guy that they killed was probably a veteran of the war. They killed him. They got away with it. They cut down the body. No one knows what happened to it. It was in 1947. There's a really good chance somebody is in there was maybe 18 or 20 years old, and they're still around. They're in their 70s. And I was contacted by a radio production crew that was they were out of the Bay Area, and they went up there to check out the story, and they got harassed to this day. They were chased out, and I was told that some equipment was even destroyed, some of the recording equipment. So they're still touchy about that up there in Callahan.
Well, it's 1947, and I think everybody, nobody can be that foolish to not have somebody in that small town that has the wherewithal to understand the ramifications of this story coming out. 1847, it's embarrassing, but the 1947, so...
Yeah.
What's interesting, too, is that, and what I really haven't mentioned, that this book is chock full of all kinds of stories, so we're just featuring a few of the stories because we can't go through all of them.
Uh-huh.
But one thing that's prevalent through all the stories is that there is a outright conspiracy in these towns with these vigilante committees, whereas no one ever comes forward. So either they're silenced but they're silenced effectively, and I found that odd, given that you know from true crime itself that there seems to be always somebody that eventually will open up their mouth. But what's interesting about this is officially how many stories that are throughout this entire book where people did conspire to keep their mouth shut forever.
Yeah, almost in every single one of these cases, especially where it was a lynching, people knew and they kept quiet about it. You have to realize that even now, those small towns in California are still small towns, and everyone knows each other. Everyone knows their business. And there's the code of the Old West that is still strong here in California, where you don't ask too many questions. And you can never ask a guy how many cattle he has, don't ask too many questions. It's not a good thing. That happens up in the dry hills, actually where we're having the big fires right now, because there's a lot of illegal marijuana cultivation up there and meth labs, and people know about it, but no one says anything because that's just the code of the West out there.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask this question, too, because you do have a theme that goes through this book, obviously, that you've decided to write about. Again, not every single crime, not every single murder. It would be, like you say, the size of a huge telephone book, and that would just be scratching the surface. But what is it about assassination? Because we're going to talk about now about Sirhan and the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Why is it that you have included lynchings and from 1860, and what is it that connects this assassination, we'll say, of Robert Kennedy, and we'll also talk about assassination of Harvey Milk and others in San Francisco. So tell us what it is about this assassination or the assassination of prominent figures that's in the theme of this book, which includes lynchings and stuff that happened 170 years ago.
Yeah, there's a total thread about someone taking justice into their own hands. With Sirhan, I seriously don't believe that Sirhan actually murdered Robert Kennedy. There's just so many errors in the whole case that and plus Sirhan was an apolitical person. He was kind of a Gomer Pyle type character. He got kicked in the head by a horse, and he just wasn't all there. He wasn't somebody who would even follow politics, let alone have enough any kind of gumption to assassinate one. And before Robert Kennedy was shot, people saw a woman in a polka dot dress talking to Sirhan, who was just a busboy, and at the Ambassador Hotel. She was talking to him, and then supposedly he went and shot him. But it doesn't really add up. He had no reason to shoot Robert Kennedy, but a lot of other people did.
Now tell us you've got to go backwards now that you've opened up this Pandora's box here. So let's talk about, as you do in your book, about the political climate in 1968, the circumstances that brought Robert Kennedy to the position that he was about to endeavor to. And so tell us what happens involving Sirhan, but tell us before that the political climate and the circumstances that Robert Kennedy found himself in.
Well, I was 10 years old when this happened, so I was young enough or old enough to be aware of what happened. I was actually, in the house when my parents were watching, when he got shot and stuff. So it was like, holy cow. But, 1968 was, it was a very turbulent time for politics. And we were in Vietnam. Actually, my brother was in Vietnam exactly at that time. Just some hick guy from a small town in Michigan. There were like 7 people in this town of 500 people that got sent to Vietnam, which is, that affects people. And Johnson decided not to run for re-election, and Nixon was in there, and Kennedy, he was the attorney general when his brother was president, and he made a lot of enemies, especially with organized crime and the unions and things, and America was really split. It was even the Democratic Party was divided, but something about Kennedy just inspired people, and they felt there was a hope partially just because of his brother, and partially because Bobby Kennedy was a very earnest man. And, he was on the side of the people. And, of course, when that happens, there's usually always some kind of trouble or some people that want to stop that kind of thing.
Now, he was, in light of his brother, the president, being assassinated, Robert Kennedy, as you write in your book, really didn't have a security force that seemed to take the assassination of his brother into consideration, or we'll say the possibility of him being assassinated as a possibility. So tell us a little bit about who was on the security staff, but basically what type of security he really had.
He basically had no security at all. Actually, after his assassination, that's when the Secret Service decided that they were going to protect all people running for president with the Secret Service. He had writer George Plimpton. He had football player Rosie Greer, a couple other big guys. But basically, that's all he had, was just his big football friends and big writer friend, and there was no other security around. So whoever did that, they knew that the security was light. They found it was like a total hoax. There was a door jamb that had extra bullet holes in it that were different caliber, and the assistant police chief back then was Daryl Gates, who was the Los Angeles police chief during the Rodney King riots. He was in charge of all the evidence. The gun frame, the door frame was disassembled. It was supposed to be for tests and X-rays, and they said it wasn't important. They destroyed it. So there were more bullets shot than could have been in the pistol that Sirhan used.
Robert Kennedy had expressed his war against organized crime, and as you write, you don't talk about that, but you make the connection in terms of that when Sirhan, this unlikely apolitical person, again connected to nothing that would seem to indicate anything like this, when he shot Robert Kennedy, it was right behind the ear, and you talk about that, and I've read that reference before, in a typical mafioso execution style, wasn't it?
Yeah, and with the same caliber of gun too. When Hitman 2 hits, you always see in the movie they have a giant gun that like rattles windows, but basically they use small caliber pistols and they just shoot you behind the ear because no one pays that much attention to a pop. It's a little louder than a plastic bag being broken, but you hear a great big pistol go off, 45. People are going to look around. When you hear a pop, people aren't going to turn around too much. It could just be a balloon or something. I don't think that labor or mafia killed him. I'm putting my money more on like CIA or some other kind of secret organization that's within America at that time. But he had no shortage of enemies, that's for sure.
What you talk about is...
Remember, too, that Nixon was running against him, and so was George Wallace. So, there's not very likable people,
You talk about Sirhan when he is grabbed by someone, one of the security in the audience. He's still, you say, he's freakishly strong and is able to get another couple shots off into Robert Kennedy and also a couple other people as well. And these four huge security guys are having a hard time with this guy. So tell us a little bit more about this battle, because that was something that I hadn't read very much at all about that actual altercation on that day.
Yeah, Sirhan was just this little guy. He actually wanted to be a jockey at one point. That's how tiny he was. But after he fired his gun, Rosie Greer, who was one of the biggest football players of the time, just a massive man, he had a hard time holding him down. There were 4 guys on him, and he kept on firing. He hit Kennedy 2 more times after he was being pinned down. However, those 2 shots could have came from somewhere else, too. Didn't necessarily mean that. He might have fired a gun, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't somebody else firing a gun at the same time with a small caliber like that. With all the noise going on, the commotion, trays falling, carts getting knocked over, people screaming. Yeah.
And was there any determination that Sirhan had any mental issues? Was that ever considered as a defense? And was there any talk of that?
Well, yeah, they said he was temporarily insane, but they didn't care. They just railroaded him for first-degree murder, 5 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. I when I was promoting this book, I went to Bakersfield, of all places, and I thought, it'd be nice, go to this bookstore, and I get there, and there was a group of retired prison guards. They had their own little book club, and when I walked in, like 20 of these guys that were in their 60s were approached me as soon as they walked in, holding my books, and several of them worked at Kulczyk, where Sirhan is living out the rest of his life, and They told me a few funny things about him. They said that he was a total whiner, not a tough guy at all. He was just like this big complainer. Unlike Charlie Manson and all the other criminals that they have in there. And here's this guy who's supposed to, have assassinated a guy running for president, this famous family, and he was the most uncriminal person in the prison.
What I always found interesting, given that John Kennedy's assassination, and then again this seemingly lax security, and lots of people, like you say, with motive to kill him, and then the suspicious, motiveless criminal to basically have done it. And again, as you write in here too, there's some interesting things where evidence is sort of lost or misplaced, sort of at least giving notion to some of those conspiracy theories. But it seems that this is one of those conspiracy theories that really didn't have that much traction, I think, in the public.
Yeah, and the media and things were different then. I mean, if you can imagine, if we had the media, that we have now, like everyone has a camera now. Everyone has a camera, and you think about 1968. Even a video camera weighed 50 pounds back then. We're clumsy, and everyone saw you coming. You had to have a big rack of lights to light up everything. And, nowadays, here's one thing is that I've had some older relatives tell me about how bad crime is and things. And I'm saying, no, crime has actually gotten better. The cops have gotten more professional, in most cases, we hope. But, they are more educated. Back in the old days, it was Billy Bob just came back from the Army and, he ain't got no job, and they'd say, okay, here's a billy club and a gun and a badge. You're a cop. And, now when a child gets killed in Florida, we find out about it all the way across the country in a matter of hours. And it's they'll have a whole trial on cable TV when it's really just a local story. So you hear about all these things now that used to be local stories that are blown up into big major nationwide stories. Is that a good thing? I don't know. Is it a bad thing? I don't think it could ever be a bad thing if, people see how our justice system works, even if it fails or they think it fails. Sometimes there's a criminal that gets found not guilty and people are mad, but it's like they were found not guilty. What are you going to say? They were found not guilty. You can't just because public opinion says that this person did it. That's just not the way our system works.
Well, you have to let Casey Anthony know about that, because she'll be reassured, as she can't get out of her own house for the rest of her life. So
that's a perfect case. It's even 10, 15 years ago, it would have been on page 23 on section B of the paper. No one would have even remembered her name. But now things are a lot different. I can think just where I live right here in Sacramento, I live really close to the American River. Well, during the gold rush days, that was basically, not only were there steamboats going up and down the river, but on both sides of the river, there were, a mile-wide road that wagons and freight and things and stagecoaches were shipped out to, the gold mines out there. So basically where I live was a superhighway 150 years ago.
Well, let's talk about warfare at City Hall, because this is one of those cases that I'm familiar with, but again, thanks to you, you've uncovered some facts and tied it into one of the stories that's very, very compelling to everyone, especially Americans, and that's Jonestown. So incredibly, we have this story that illustrates very clearly a lot of things that, and that's why it's near the end of the book as well, but very, very important story in what it demonstrates and illustrates very clearly, and all the connections it has to in these other stories like Jonestown, which is a story very much unto itself. So let's talk about, in 1976, George Moscone, and he is mayor of San Francisco, and he's 57 years old. So tell us, 47 years old. So tell us a little bit more about the situation with George Moscone as the mayor of San Francisco.
Yeah, San Francisco, they always wanted to be highfalutin, and they liked their blue bloods. And Moscone was anything but. His father was a milkman. His mom worked at a liquor store on weekends and stuff. His father actually went mad, was put in a mental hospital. And he's a good Catholic boy, and worked his way through school, became an attorney. Worked his way up the ladder. Because like San Francisco, they don't vote for the mayor. They vote for city council people they call city supervisors, and then the city supervisors vote for the person who's going to be the mayor. So okay. It kind of goes different than it does in a lot of other towns. When Moscone came up, and at the same time Harvey Milk, who owned a camera shop in the Castro district, he was an openly gay man back then, and even in San Francisco at that time, the police used to raid gay bars there and basically steal everybody's wallet and beat up people and get a few drinks on the house and leave. It happened a lot. And so there was tension growing among the gay population there. San Francisco became a mecca for alternative lifestyles, because that's where the Navy bases were and the Army bases. And so if you were caught doing something and you were going to get dishonorably discharged, you would be discharged in San Francisco. And so instead of moving back home to, Thunder Bay, Wisconsin or something, and try to explain to your family why you were dishonorably discharged, they would just stay in San Francisco.
Right.
So, it used to be, now it's not it used to be a rough town, but now it's, millionaire's paradise. So, but the year that they were all elected were Moscone and Harvey Milk and Dan White. It was because they decided, instead of having at-large supervisors where you just get a big pool of people and you vote for it and the top 16 people get in, they decided to have it in the districts so that there'd be a representative of certain neighborhoods or certain parts of town. And so that's how Harvey Milk and Dan White got into office.
Now tell us about Dan White. You say he's all-American fellow from, Irish background, working class, a former Marine sergeant, you said, and he was a Vietnam vet who apparently later admitted he had never fired his weapon at anyone the entire time he was in Vietnam. So tell us a little bit more about Dan White and what develops between Harvey Milk and Dan White as supervisors.
Well, Dan White was kind of pushed into the position to run for the city supervisor. He was just backed up by the powers that be to represent the part of the city of the Southside Valley, Excelsior, which is a real nice neighborhood now. You can't get a house for less than $1 million there. So they thought that Moscone and Milk were too liberal. They weren't pushing the city pro-downtown, pro-business power base was disappearing. So, but Dan White was a fireman, and this has come out just recently, is that he was actually homosexual, and he had a very self-hate problem because he couldn't admit to what he was, and so instead he took his anger out against gays that way. They only made like $10,000 a year, so Harvey Milk had his own store and employees and things, but Dan White ended up selling he had a baked potato stand over at Fisherman's Wharf that he was set up in. But White didn't know how to play politics at all, and he would actually take people at their word and stuff, and he once pitched an idea about having a board of supervisors softball team, and everyone laughed at him and stuff. So he just didn't think that he would be able to get anything done as a city council person, and he was going broke basically. He had a family to support, and he was just getting pressure from everybody on how to do his job, and he just wasn't cut out for politics. So he put in his resignation and then changed his mind about it, and he went to Moscone. He actually snuck into City Hall because he was so well known. He knocked down a window on the first floor, and there was a janitor's area, dressing room, locker room or something, and he said, "Oh, hey, I forgot my ID," and he just crawled in through the window. And that's how he got into City Hall with his gun. And he went to talk to Moscone, and Moscone said that he was not going to accept him to come back, and he shot him several times right in the face.
And then what did he proceed to do from there?
Well, then he walked over to Harvey Milk's office and shot him too. Killed him right there. He went to leave, and he bumped into Dianne Feinstein, who is our senator now. She's a senior senator. She was just ready to quit politics completely when her term was done as city supervisor. And she saw Dan White walking down the hallway, and she said hi to him, and he just walked by. She didn't know that he had just killed the mayor and Harvey Milk. So when he was caught fairly quick. Everyone knew he did it, and the police, gave him a nice cell, and they waited on him, got him meals out of restaurants and stuff like that, and it was. He was protected by the police department.
The police were very, very unhappy with Harvey Milk, and that's why they gave their support to White after the murder, and basically in that they were showing their sympathy for White and against Milk and Moscone with their policy that they were about to enact, right?
Yeah. And San Francisco, like I said, the cops were they were all dirty Harry, back up until the 80s. I have a friend whose father was a motorcycle patrolman in San Francisco. He's been dead for a long time now, but she told me that she was riding the bus home from Catholic school, and she was in her Catholic schoolgirl outfit, and some kid on the bus started hassling her and beat her up. And she told her father, and he got off on the motorcycle, called some buddies, and they never saw that kid again. Kid disappeared. So that's the kind of San Francisco you were dealing with. So when White had his trial, he ended up getting like 7 years. It's just ridiculous. And it caused a riot in San Francisco that they actually used a lot of the photos for stock photos of riots, because they burned police cars and tipped over things. Dianne Feinstein stepped outside of the city hall to tell everybody, to calm down, and someone hit her in the head with like a rock. And there's still clips of that around. She just disappears among she's standing there in front of the microphone. There's all these cops and everything around her, and you see this rock hit her, and she just goes down. So she ended up becoming the mayor, almost by default. She was ready to go back and get out of politics completely, and now she's a U.S. senator for 20-something years.
What
so
we didn't talk about? We didn't talk about his defense, which was the infamous Twinkie defense that he had eaten this junk food and was on a sugar high, and it was an absurd defense, but they did trot it out in court. What was really the gist of the nature of the anger that the crowd had in that riot, and who constituted the vast majority of those people that were rioting?
Oh, it was the gay population of San Francisco came out, along with a lot of punk rockers and former hippies, and just basically people that were very angry. They wanted to see changes happen in San Francisco. And you always see that when somebody does something horrible and they're very connected, and then they get, a slap on the wrist. This is a total slap on the wrist. There are things that happen when that riot happened. Cops went into the Castro and totally trashed out a bunch of gay bars and beat everybody with clubs. Just like it was a police riot. So while there was this riot happening uptown, another team of cops went in, just took it on themselves, put tape over their badges, and just started clubbing everyone they saw. Because the riot happened just as, people were upset. They were standing outside, and then they were like, well, they saw more and more people, and they started heading towards City Hall, and before they knew it, they had thousands and thousands of people coming up towards City Hall.
And in the end, Harvey Milk really does become sort of a beacon for the movement of representing sort of oppression at its worst as well, because he was so connected and so active in that gay community, and then he was killed. So wasn't he seen as that sort of martyr for this cause?
Yeah, he definitely was a martyr to that cause, because he was a funny guy. He was also pretty cranky. He wasn't like a Mr. Nice Guy. He was, a wise guy. New York, first generation American, and he was one of the first people to go out there and say, hey, it's none of your business what we do.
What was the inevitable fate of Dan White? What became of him?
Well, he got out of prison. He did not do that much of his time. He was paroled in 1984, so he only did about 6 years. After probation, Feinstein was the mayor, said, don't come back to San Francisco. It's his hometown. There was no other place he ever lived. He was a total San Francisco boy, as much as Joe DiMaggio or somebody, And he did come back to his old neighborhood, and he ended up committing suicide only about a year after he got out of prison, almost right after he got off his probation. He tied a hose to his exhaust pipe and gassed himself. Yeah, incredible story. And tell us now about the Jonestown connection, because it's not so tenuous, but tell us the connection with Jonestown, because it's one of those stories, again, that's very, very compelling in American history. Oh, well, you know about George? Your listeners know about Georgetown, do they? Have you had someone
know about
Jones?
It? Well, I'm just saying the connection that they have. We're not going to go through the Jonestown itself, but just the connection that they have with San Francisco and the city itself and some of the players here.
Yeah, well, Jim Jones, he had the People's Temple, and it was the original one was right across the street from the Fillmore Auditorium. There's a post office there now, but before that was his church, and he fed people and clothed people and did those kind of Christian things. Mayor Moscone put him on a God, what was that? He put him on a committee for housing or something. Now, San Francisco's Housing Authority. He had no idea what was going to happen, and that just happened. The whole People's Temple mass suicide or mass murder happened just before all this happened. Just a few weeks before Moscone was killed. So. Yeah, there's the old line that comedians never tell jokes about the People's Temple because the punchline's too long.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't want to laugh at because we always have victims and I've been criticized.
Yeah,
and I really don't. But yeah, what I wanted to say with the Jonestown as well is that the incredible story. Is that on Harvey Milk, I guess mistakenly, obviously, was very supportive of Jim Jones, even when there was criticism. And same as if I'm not correct, is that Moscone was the same, where Jim Jones had duped these guys as well into believing that he was some benevolent soul and had some good ideas, and so very, very tragic story, and quite the connection as well to two amazing stories, with Harvey Milk and Moscone.
And you have to remember that the People's Temple, that they brought a lot of voters in, for Moscone and for White. Those people would take whatever advice Jones gave them about it, but he would produce the voters. When it came time for Election Day, he made sure that his people went and voted. And that's important, especially, in a city the size of San Francisco, which is like 9 by 7 miles. It's actually a very small city and area.
Now, before we wrap up, David, I wanted to ask you, what was the overall, if you can't come up with one snap conclusion, but what was overall doing this project? What was your conclusion after all of this? I'm sure you went in with some preconceptions, and then you came out with, as all authors do, with a different picture, at least a more informed picture. So tell us what you discovered after all of this that might have been profound.
I think that what I discovered most about this, and this book came out 7 years ago. It was it was my first one. It was kind of my baby. I had written a lot of articles and things like that, but this was my first shot as a book. And I guess what surprised me the most is that everyone who took justice into their own hands believed that they were right.
Sure.
And that to me is a pretty powerful thing, because we all have our ethics and things that we were taught by our culture where we lived, our parents, or whatever, the things that influence you. And but there is like right and wrong, and pretty much everybody knows that, what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes when, just like the terrorist family that lived up in Lookout in 1901, or like in Little Lake too, the people had to take matters into their own hands, or else they would have to live with terrorism. And people think of terrorism as a modern day thing, but when you're in a town that's 50 miles in any direction to another town, and you can only get around by horseback, sometimes you have to make those decisions. Sometimes they were right. Most of the time they were wrong. Little Lake, they were probably right for doing that. Lookout, they were probably right. In Ukiah, when they hung Ford, they had 4 murderers in their jail at one time in 1895. The people were like, here's this little town, 12,000 people, county the size of Rhode Island, and what are they going to do? They have 4 murderers in their little jail, and none of them were from there. None of them had roots there. They got rid of them. They believed they were right, and they were never caught. But anybody that's involved in any kind of situation like this, they're going to think of that for the rest of their life. That whole thing is going to be burned into their memory. They'll never forget it. They'll never forget the smells, the sight, the last words of these people that they took justice in their own hands about. That was something that they are all going to have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
In the case in Santa Rosa where these gangsters shot a bunch of cops, they were lynched. And afterwards, just actually while I was writing this book, came out that this one old man said, I was 18 years old when that happened, and I was in on it. And he spun this whole story. I put it in a book. But really, if he was an 18-year-old kid, he was just there as backup muscle and show. He didn't have anything to do with what they were doing, and but evidently, he died an old man, and he never forgot the lynching of those 3 gangsters.
What's interesting too is that we hadn't mentioned this. It seems like a good percentage of the stories in this book where there were lynchings, that the people took the effort to wear masks, didn't they?
Yeah. And everyone pretty much knew who all these people were. I mean, you're dealing with these small villages, basically, and they were your uncle, they were your father, they were your brother, they were your neighbors. And like I said before, no one's going to be ostracized by their community because they turned in somebody who was basically in on a vigilante justice that they couldn't fix any other way.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a fascinating book, California Justice, Shootouts, Lynchings, and Assassinations in the Golden State. I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about this book. For those that might want to look at other work, like you say, this is your first true crime book. You have tell our audience how many true crime books you have and how they might contact you if you're interested in if you have a website or a Facebook. Tell us about how people might contact you.
Well, yeah, I'm on Facebook. I have a Death in California site on Facebook. All my books are available on Amazon, and of course they can always be ordered online, Goodreads or anything like that. My second book is Death in California, the bizarre, freakish, and curious ways people die in the Golden State. There's plenty of murders and things in that one, too, but there's also a lot of freak accidents and airplane crashes and things like that. After California Justice came out, the publisher thought they might want to lighten up a little bit, but I managed to sneak in a Death in California. And my latest book is California's Fruit, Flakes, and Nuts, and it's about California crazy, crackpots, creeps, eccentrics, stupid criminals. It's kind of my thing right now is very, very stupid crimes. In Fruit, Flakes, and Nuts, I kind of focus on people who lived pretty much a normal life and then had one bad day. So.
Yeah, I've read a little bit of it already with a session musician named Jim Gordon. I believe that it's, again, fascinating tale about how if you were listening to radio today, if you're listening to classic rock radio today, you're probably hearing him every day play the drums. He was on 29 records in 1 year alone, and went on to be one of the most popular session drummers. So he's probably on something that you're going to listen to every day in, day out. So very, very interesting book. But I want to thank you for coming on and talking about the most murderous of the 3 books that you have, which is California Justice, and a fascinating story about lynchings and assassinations, all kinds of stories I've never heard of, and also just an amazing time in history. Again, when you think you know a lot about history, comes along this book. So thank you very much, and you have a great evening. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you very much, David. You have a great night. Good night.
You too. Thank you.